Welcome, everybody, to the Trade Justice Alliance Sunday webinar. My name is Carrie Marks. I'm your moderator this evening. We have a great call planned tonight. Besides our advertised main speaker, Alyshia Gálvez, we also have Celeste Drake joining us tonight. So it should be a great call, and I welcome everybody to the call tonight. I'm with the Trade Justice Alliance team for about a year and a half now. I help with social media and tech stuff. I'm running the call panel tonight, and I will be your moderator for the evening. If you are listening to me, then you already know our phone number. And if you are in the meeting room looking at that phone number out on the wall, that's what you need to call in order to hear anything. This meeting room and our phone line are courtesy of the folks at People Demanding Action, so we want to thank them very much. Thank you, Andrea Miller and her team over there. You can visit our website at tradejustice.net, and we have a Facebook group called Trade Justice Alliance. So if you are not a member of that group, please head over there sometime tonight and join up, and then you'll be able to stay abreast of all our upcoming calls. Our first speaker tonight is Celeste Drake. Celeste is an alumni member of the Trade Justice Alliance group, I am very proud to say. And she is currently the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist with AFL-CIO. Celeste is coming to us hot off the Ways and Means Committee meetings where she testified about the NAFTA modernization that has been undertaken by our government. Celeste, your line is open. Welcome to the call, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Hi, thanks, Carrie. Glad to be here. Again, my name is Celeste Drake, and I work for the AFL-CIO, which is the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. We're a federation of 55 labor unions that work in every sector of the economy that you can think of, public and private, agriculture to services to manufacturing. I invite you to follow me on Twitter. You can see my Twitter handle there on the slide. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is just a little bit about the hearing, the Ways and Means hearing at which I testified, and kind of what the state of play is here in Washington, D.C. on NAFTA. And if we have time, I'll take a couple of questions, and then you can get on to your main speaker. So the hearing was held by the Trade Subcommittee of the Committee on Ways and Means, which is the kind of known as the most prestigious committee in the House of Representatives, and it handles Social Security, Medicare, taxes, and trade. So it's got the big stuff. And this particular subcommittee was actually very well attended. I think there was maybe one member who was missing. So there were 6 Democrats and 10 or 11 Republicans. I was a witness that was called by the Democratic side. The other 3 witnesses were called by the Republican side, and then there was a second panel after I testified that similarly had 3 Republican witnesses and 1 Democratic witness. It should be available to watch online. If you're that interested, you can go ahead and do it. The hearings start with opening statements from each witness, so we each had 5 minutes. I can say that the 3 Republican witnesses all talked about how great NAFTA is, how NAFTA is a success, and it really just needs a modernization. And it was clearly orchestrated because each person mentioned either, in passing or focused as a main point of their opening statement on ISDS and how great ISDS is and how it's got to stay in NAFTA because it's really critical. And for anyone that's new on the call to Trade Justice Alliance, ISDS you'll hear a lot about in these discussions of trade. It stands for Investor to State Dispute Settlement. And it's essentially, we try to condense it down to corporate courts to get the point across in 2 words. It's a private justice system where foreign investors and only foreign investors get to bring claims against the host government of the country where they've invested, and they can challenge anything from actual takings, as we would do in federal court under the Fifth Amendment, to so-called indirect takings, which means you've put a regulation or law that so offends me and my potential profits that I'm going to say it's the same as a taking, to challenges for a violation of the right to fair and equitable treatment, which is as vague as it sounds. And again, that's the main thing that these firms use to challenge. And it's essentially a tool of power, having this ability to go before a private arbitration panel and challenge a government's law, regulation, federal, state, or local, even a judicial outcome, is really a tool of power, because they know that the government that they're challenging, it's going to cost $8 million on average to defend such a case, and that there is a chance of losing, in which case they'll have to pay a huge fine to the winning company representing their lost expected profits. So in many cases, just the threat of a case gets the government to withdraw or amend the offending law or regulation, which is really the business's goal in the first place. So they all talked about that. What I talked about was NAFTA isn't, in fact, a success. If you're only looking from the perspective of global corporate profits, or you're only looking at the perspective of the 1%, you could say NAFTA is a success, because any gains from trade have all gone to the top. But we don't look at that perspective as labor unions. We look at how it's going for average worker, for the bulk of society. And from that perspective, it's been bad. And it's been bad whether you look at downward pressure on wages. It's been bad whether you look at U.S. firms who have lost and their workers 850,000 jobs. It's bad whether you look at the perspective of Mexico, where you had small farmers who could not compete against subsidized U.S. agriculture and got pushed off their land. And then when they got to the cities to find new jobs, those jobs were either non-existent or largely sweatshop jobs. There's just no perspective really from working people by which NAFTA could be a success. And then I talked about some of our top recommendations to fix that. We can't just quote-unquote modernize. So when you say somebody wants to modernize NAFTA, what they're saying is they barely want to do anything at all. They want to tweak it. So we want renegotiations done in public, just like we called for in the TPP. We want ISDS taken out. It's already in NAFTA. We want it out. We want real standards for labor and environment that aren't in these side agreements that you can't enforce, but the standards are high, the standards are clear, and you have certainty of prompt enforcement. We also want to make sure that you have rules of origin that promote production in North America, not just the U.S., but all the countries, because that way you're saying we've made commitments to each other, and we're going to give the bulk of the benefits of the trade deal to the countries that have made those commitments. Otherwise, you have leakage to other countries which might have even worse labor and environmental standards. We also say affordable medicines are important, so let's not add a bunch more obligations for patent protections and other intellectual property protections for big pharma. That's actually not helpful if you want to free up trade. That's the opposite. And it's bad for people, and it's bad for state budgets that are trying to provide drugs through public health programs such as Medicaid. Then we want NAFTA to go farther and say, you know what we should do as North American countries is make sure that we're all investing in public infrastructure so that benefits from trade can be shared and not grabbed by the 1%. And we should look at looking at our tax system and making sure our tax system isn't full of corporate giveaways and loopholes that allow us to do all this economic activity and not capture any back so that we can do that investment that we need in infrastructure. So that was my testimony. The questions were interesting. I was ignored by virtually every Republican. The Democrats mostly wanted to talk about labor rights, which is good. but we're trying to get them off this track of you can do anything you want in a trade agreement so long as you have some strong labor rights, and that's going to make it okay. Because we have said for years and years and years since the first NAFTA, that's a necessary thing to do, is high labor standards that are swiftly enforced, but it's not sufficient. There's a lot more. And so I did get one opportunity to respond to Mr. Danny Davis, representative from Illinois, about the fact that you've got to have a lot more in there. So this was the first hearing in Congress on this NAFTA modernization that wasn't just essentially interviewing Lighthizer, who was the new USTR, the new U.S. person in charge of trade. And we hope that there are more. We have recommended that there be more both on the House side and on the Senate side, and not just in the committees that traditionally oversee trade, but in the committees that oversee labor and the committees that oversee commerce and these other committees. Because when you look at the membership of the Finance Committee in the Senate, excuse me, and the Ways and Means Committee in the House, they don't really represent the whole bulk of the attitudes towards trade amongst either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Both of those committees happen to be a lot more sort of pro-status quo trade than other committees. So we want everyone looking at this, and we want all sides to be able to speak up. And it's critical that they do this now, because the negotiations will start in Washington, D.C. on August 16th. There's been a reporting, but not confirmed, that the U.S. wants to go every 3 weeks with rounds of negotiations, so starting August 16th and going every 3 weeks. That would be incredibly fast. With other trade agreements that were under negotiation during the Obama administration, like the TPP and the TTIP, the rounds were at least 6 weeks apart and sometimes up to 12 weeks apart. So sort of on average like every other month, about 8 weeks. So going every 3 weeks would be incredibly fast. There are still those in the administration talking about trying to finish up by the end of this year. That doesn't seem realistic because there is a lot to talk about unless you assume that the parties are just going to re-agree to everything they already agreed to in the TPP, which is certainly a risk. However, I believe that Canada and Mexico are trying to be more strategic at that and going to the U.S. and saying, if you want to reopen this, we actually have some things that we want that are very different than what you were able to get out of the TPP. And I believe that they are going to try and make sure that it's not just the U.S. demanding new things. And the interesting thing is, unlike the TPP, there's something in the background. There's the status quo NAFTA. So for the negotiating parties, if one party asks for too much or tries to go too far, they can consider, well, let's go back to the status quo, because these three governments, with the exception of President Trump, actually like NAFTA. For us as activists, our fallback, if we didn't get a better NAFTA, would be no NAFTA, because the current NAFTA is actually quite bad and quite harmful for working people and the environment and wages and all of those other things. So that's going to be the trick of trying to figure out how we as activists can do that, and how do we do a little jujitsu where we get them, if they don't do what we want with a progressive agreement, get the fallback to be, well, NAFTA's got to be repealed altogether. And so that's what folks are kind of working on, and we're going to be presenting a strategic organizing mobilization plan around this to our Council of Presidents next week at the AFL-CIO, and we'll see if they approve it and how that moves forward. But we should be thinking of organizing around the rounds, which we don't know how often or how many there will be at this point, except for August 16th. But we should be thinking of that direction and how we can work to make sure that, you know, even those folks who voted for Trump, which I know is not a lot, or any of the folks on this call, but these are the folks that need to understand that a quote-unquote modernization of NAFTA isn't going to cut it. It's not going to be the thing that Trump promised them when they voted for him. And so it is going to take a lot of outreach and education and informing people that all those things they hated about TPP can't be repeated in NAFTA, and they're not going to be acceptable just because Trump tries to put some spin on them. So that's sort of where we are, and it's going to be a challenge, but that's where we are, and I will stop there.
Wow. Thank you, Celeste. It was a big, big, big week, wasn't it? So, everybody, we have a few minutes to ask Celeste some questions. If you are listening on the phone and you have a question for Celeste, you can either type it in the chat box, which I see some people are doing, if you can see the chat, Celeste. Otherwise, press *6 on your phone, and that will put you into the caller queue, and I'll be able to unmute your mic and call on you, and you can ask in real life. So while we are filling up the caller queue, there is one question for Celeste from Clarice. It says, why can or do Dems call only one witness and Repubs call 3 at these meetings?
That's a great question. So how they do it in both the House and the Senate is depending on the overall representation, like who's got more members in the House or Senate gets more funding. They actually, the majority party runs the committee, and they get more funding for more staff, and they get more members on the committee, and they get to call more witnesses. And how that works out for each particular hearing is usually the majority says, okay, we want 4 witnesses and we'll give you 1. The minority party can try to negotiate for better, but they don't have any leverage really to do so. So typically they'll push back, and then the majority party says, well, this is how it's going to be. And so the minority party says, okay, X is who we want for our witness. So sometimes you will see different numbers. It won't always be sort of 3/4 and 1/4, but it's really up to that majority party. In the Senate, they're a little more, as they call it, collegial, and you might find a little better balance, but not by very much. And that's also true if the Democrats are in the majority, which isn't very often these days. But they will call the majority of witnesses, and then the Republican minority will have few. So that's standard.
Wow, thanks, Celeste. All right, we do have a couple people in the queue now. Caller at 401, your line is open.
Hello, this is Christopher Curry. What are the chances of killing NAFTA altogether?
I don't even think I know. We're going to have to get into it a little more before I feel comfortable making predictions, but I'll say we do have an uphill battle. We now know that when, President Trump suddenly was going to withdraw, and then suddenly the next day had changed his mind, he was actually stopped from doing so because Jared Kushner and others in his administration got on the phone to counterparts in Canada and in Mexico to call him and tell him what a big mistake that would be and that he really should try to fix it before he withdraws. So what we learn from that is that there are power players in each of the 3 governments involved that have an interest in the status quo. And why do they have an interest in the status quo? The same reason why NAFTA got passed in the first place. It's the same reason we have a tax system that redistributes money upwards. It's really that, unfortunately, our governments are generally, executing the will and the policy preferences of the corporations and the 1%. And that will, there are exceptions to that. So you'll see, for instance, the Democrats and the Republicans fighting it out now over health care, and the Democrats saying, well, whatever you do, you can't make it worse. And that is fighting for average folks. It's not just fighting for Wall Street, but unfortunately sort of the bulk of our government's policies are skewed to benefit those classes that also benefit from NAFTA. So what we've got to do is, while we're fighting and fighting and fighting for a more progressive NAFTA, we've actually got to open the door and talk to those Republicans who probably don't agree with us on anything else, but also don't like NAFTA, and get them to see that some of the things that we're asking for are things that are right in line with what they should be asking for. You know, those kind of Republicans shouldn't like ISDS any more than we do. Those kind of Republicans may not like unions, but they shouldn't want other countries abusing workers to gain a trade advantage any more than we do. Those kind of Republicans should like, you know, good, strong rules of origin and good, strong ability to use our own regulatory standards or our own government purchasing preferences. So we've got to open those doors and make sure that those Republicans are also speaking up to say that no NAFTA would be better than a bad one. And that's going to be hard, and it's also going to be hard on Democrats. There are many Democrats who might normally agree with us. However, they may be right now focused on, don't ever give President Trump a win. And if they're more focused on not giving President Trump a win, then, you know, trying to play this jujitsu game with us that gets us a good deal, whether that's a really good NAFTA or no NAFTA, then that could be a problem. So it's, you know, and I've heard some Democratic folks say around Washington, well, if Trump is against TPP and NAFTA, then, you know, maybe they're really good. And we've got to get the Democrats off that. So all I will say is at this point it's too early to know potential for success, but we know it's a really uphill battle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Celeste. I have to agree with you. I watched several many hours of those meetings this week, and it's an uphill battle, but focus like a laser beam and find common ground is what I hear you saying. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay with you, Celeste.
Sure, one more.
All right, caller at area code 908, your line is open.
Thank you very much. This is Wendy Getz in Newton, New Jersey. Thank you, Celeste. I am concerned with short, concise ISDS messaging. For example, for banners, signs, you know, if we tow it behind an airplane, we have 50 characters. You know, what is our clear messaging going forward describing ISDS?
So you'll have to count the characters, but I think corporate courts as a term has actually taken off, and I've heard it used quite a bit in Europe about the TTIP and about the CETA, and, you know, so does corporate court speak to someone that hasn't been quite involved? It doesn't say the whole thing, but it probably is enough to get folks to ask questions. I also try to describe it as private justice, and I think that, again, doesn't tell you the whole lay of the land, but it really gets down to what's really offensive about it, that it is private justice for a certain class, right? We all go to the public courts. We all have the same form of justice except foreign investors. And foreign investors get this private justice that none of the rest of us have access to. And that means one thing in the U.S., but think about these other countries that have justice systems that are even less fundamentally fair and reliable than the U.S. And what you're saying is, you know, really world-class private justice for the wealthy foreign investor, and everybody else, we don't really care. And so if you can think of something around maybe those phrases, either corporate courts or private justice, that fits within your limit, I would recommend that.
Thank you.
Wow. All right. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on short notice and giving us that great update. And for anybody that wants to hear more from Celeste, guess what? She's going to be one of our featured speakers on next month's call. Yay! So more about that later in the call. But meanwhile, bless you, Celeste. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks, Carrie. Good luck with the rest of the call. I know it's going to be good.
Thanks.
All right. Well, tonight we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Alyshia Gálvez. She was the founding director of the Jaime Lucero Mexican Studies Institute at the City University of New York. Dr. Galvez is the author of 2 books on Mexican immigration in New York, Patient Citizens, Immigrant Mothers, Mexican Women, and Public Prenatal Care and the Birth Weight Paradox. And this is from Rutgers University Press, October 2011, and winner of the 2012 ALLA Book Award from the Association of Latino and Latin American Anthropologists. And Guadalupe in New York, Devotion and Struggle for Citizenship Rights Among Mexican Immigrants at NYU Press, December 2009. Dr. Galvez is a cultural and medical anthropologist and Associate Professor of Latin American, Latino, and Puerto Rican Studies at Lehman College, CUNY. She is currently finishing a book entitled Eating NAFTA, Food and Trade Policies and the Destruction of Mexico, UC Press, and that is forthcoming, on changing food policies, systems, and practices in Mexico and Mexican communities in the United States, and that is including the ways they are impacted by trade and economic policy and their public health implications. Welcome, Dr. Gálvez.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You're welcome.
Should I get started?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. It is already a really interesting conversation to hear from Celeste from the trenches in Washington. As you said in the introduction, I'm a cultural anthropologist and a medical anthropologist, and I am very interested in what NAFTA looks like on the ground. I've been studying Mexican migration since around 2000, and mainly migration from Mexico to the city of New York. And I became very interested in what were the reasons that people were leaving their home communities. But I also became very interested in diet-related illness because the book that you mentioned in the intro that came out in 2011 had to do with health outcomes. And generally speaking, when we look at immigrant health in the United States, we find that immigrants tend to have better health than those of us who were born and have grown up in the United States. And so when I began learning about the incredible rise in prevalence of diet-related illness in Mexico as well as in Mexican communities in the U.S., I wondered how that kind of jived with what I already knew to be about the healthy eating habits and health outcomes of the same population. So I was interested in somewhat doing an ethnography of NAFTA. And so, Celeste raised a lot of the critiques of NAFTA that I don't think have been on the radar in terms of some of the mainstream discussions of NAFTA. I know that for all of you, they very much are on your radar, so I won't summarize them in detail. But, essentially, this characterization of Mexico winning is incorrect, and the characterization that somehow the U.S. is losing at Mexico's expense is incorrect. And as Celeste very clearly stated, it's the billionaires who are winning, and it's a corporate power grab. And there were very powerful private interests in Mexico that were pushing for NAFTA initially. And they had very specific goals in mind that were not particularly about leveling the playing field. They were not particularly about a lot of the things that ended up becoming the trade agreement. It was really about them protecting their own private interests. And so when we hear about the ISDS discussion, et cetera, we can see the resurgence of those very specific interests of very particular, powerful people who have a lot to gain from these trade agreements that don't really have much to do with workers' rights or the prosperity of people in the signatory countries in general terms. And so if we could go to the third slide, I have this quote from Lauren Berlant in which she refers to slow death. And in my book, I am really framing the rise of diet-related illness in Mexico as a kind of structural violence. Structural violence comes to us from medical anthropology. Paul Farmer most famously discusses it in terms of, things like the earthquake in Haiti, and oftentimes it's associated with with disasters or other kinds of sort of rapid assaults on the health of a community. And I am framing diet-related illness as rather as a slow-moving version of structural violence. It's structural violence because it has a differential impact on people situated differently in society. Social categories determine outcomes. And the insidious nature of the slowness of it is what contributes to it in some ways dispelling efforts at activism and mobilization, because it's harder to put your finger on something that's slow moving. It's harder to identify causality. And as I'm sure you're all familiar, the food and beverage corporations have invested a great deal of energy and effort into making diet-related illness seem like a mystery, like something that might not have clearly identifiable causes. And I'll talk more in a few minutes about the emphasis on self-care and on individual behaviors that they've succeeded in setting up. And so what this does is it kind of allows Mexico's food and trade policy and its relationship with its trading partners through NAFTA to be obscured as causal factors in terms of the rise of diet-related illness. So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to skip ahead. If you don't mind, we'll skip the next two slides and go to the one after with the Coca-Cola truck. Basically, we've seen after NAFTA an incredible increase in the availability and the affordability of processed foods and beverages throughout Mexico. So this is a town that I've spent a lot of time in the state of Puebla. It has narrow roads, and it used to be relatively difficult to get there from the capital city of Puebla or from Tehuacan, which is the closest medium-sized city. The roads weren't that great. It wasn't so easy to get there. But as we can see now, the roads are paved, and a lot of people told me the first thing to come down a newly paved road is the Coca-Cola truck. We can also see that there's it's 6 pesos for a half liter of Coca-Cola being advertised on the back of the truck. That at that time was about 35 cents. For a half-liter bottle. It appears that Coca-Cola charges less in rural and indigenous communities than it does in cities, presumably in an effort to expand consumption and make it as affordable as possible. This photo was taken, I believe, just before the soda tax went into effect, which would be about a peso per liter. So it would be $6.50 after this. So we see an increase in processed foods and beverages, the availability, the affordability, but we see this accompanied by a decline of what I call the milpa-based diet. So a milpa is a cornfield, historically on small agricultural holdings. corn would be intercropped with chiles and beans and squash. They live and grow quite happily together. I'm not that kind of scientist, but there are, I think, benefits in terms of the soil replenishing its minerals and nutrients when as opposed to monocrop, they're intercropped cultivations. And the historical diet in Mesoamerica, Tehuacan, just near here, is where corn was initially midwived into existence by Mesoamerican farmers several thousand years ago. And the milpa-based diet really was not substantively altered with the arrival of the Spanish and even into industrialization and urbanization in the 20th century. There certainly were a lot of new additions in terms of old world foods, particularly animal protein and fat, lard of large domesticated animals. But we still see corn being the main staple throughout the region, especially in the rural areas. Really, it's only with the changes that are brought by NAFTA that we see a real threat to the dominance of the milpa-based diet, and we see a decline in the availability and affordability of eating like that that is unprecedented. Let's see. So if we can move to the next slide, we will see some of the health consequences. This is just in the last 10 years. The numbers are more stark if we look at the whole NAFTA period, but we can see, I like these charts because they very visually show us the changes over time. So we see that Mexico has really, it's the infectious diseases and diseases related to sanitation, malnutrition, decline, and we see a rise in diet-related illness. So in this chart, for me, the most shocking part is in the third column on the far right, where we can see an incredible rise in heart disease, 40% in the last decade, 28% for diabetes, 40% for chronic kidney disease, and just an incredible increase. If we look at the next slide, we see that when we look at death and disability combined, diabetes is number one, and it's up by 20% just in the last 10 years. Heart disease about 25, chronic kidney disease about 25. And if we move to the next slide, you can see an example of the public health ministry's approach to diet-related illness. Mexico's soda tax has been very broadly acclaimed around the world in some circles for being quite progressive. It is a miracle to get any soda tax passed because the industry is so aggressive against any effort to tax or regulate. But if you talk to people who were involved in it, we can see that the tax, even though it passed, was chipped away quite significantly in ways that advocates, nonprofit organizations, civil society, nutritionists, dietitians were appalled by. So when they did the mathematical modeling to see what would actually trigger a decline in consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, they said it needed to be at least 2 pesos per liter, and half of that was what was passed, 1 peso per liter. The tax revenues were targeted to go towards installing water fountains in public schools. Most schools in the Republic do not have potable water, drinking water, and that has been dismally in the 2 years since the tax was passed. There's been very little, almost no progress on installing water fountains in the public schools. And what we see, what I my analysis of the public health approach is really that it's very much based on a neoliberal approach to everything. Health in a neoliberal economic formulation is just another thing that can be purchased. It's something that is framed within a market-based system in which consumers can choose to consume healthfully, or they can choose to consume in ways that they know are not healthful, but ultimately it's individuals that are making choices. Healthcare is not framed as a right. The government is not framed in a way as having a responsibility for ensuring the health of its population. The structural shifts in terms of the food system, food distribution, pricing, subsidies, et cetera, are not taken into consideration as being relevant to the shifts in health. And so I, as part of my research, interviewed architects of the soda tax as well as the larger public health campaign to address diabetes and obesity, which is being framed by them as a disease in itself, even though that's somewhat controversial, which we can talk about in the Q&A. There's even though public health analysts, scholars are pretty much in agreement that if you want to have an impact on population level rates of any kind of not just diet-related disease, but any sort of health indicator, then it needs to happen at the structural level first. Small bore, individual changes, lifestyle changes are shown to be stubbornly unresponsive and ineffective in terms of an approach to population health. And yet we see that the marketing is really about, check yourself, moderate yourself. Medite means to measure yourself, but moderate yourself and move. And the move, just like the Let's Move campaign that Michelle Obama was co-opted by the food and beverage industry in the U.S. Similarly, in Mexico, the food and beverage corporations offered to, be hand in hand with the government on this, in part so that they could dumb down the message. And it's about exercise. And so we see this promotion of energy balance theory, which is very problematic and framed around the idea that a calorie is a calorie, and if you can consume any kind of calories. It can be soda, it can be chips, it can be sugar-sweetened cereals. It doesn't matter as long as you're burning an equivalent number of calories or more calories than you're taking in if you want to achieve weight loss. And this is really a very problematic framing of the issue. It's not supported by the science. And it's very consumer-based. And so what we see behind it is that there is the other pieces of the neoliberal approach are not just the self-care piece, but also self-regulation, an attack on any kind of regulation. So Mexico, in addition to having an incredible increase in processed foods and beverages, has been an incredible increase in chemicals that are exported from the U.S. For agricultural processing, for food processing. There are specific chemicals that Mexico previously banned, some of the BPA chemicals. They were forced to get rid of their bans. Mexico had somewhat more of a regulatory framework that was somewhat more similar to the EU, in which chemicals have to be proven safe before they're used in agriculture or in food processing. But through NAFTA, we basically obliged them to get rid of that framework and adopt our regulatory framework, which allows things to be used somewhat freely until they are proven harmful, which, as we know, is somewhat difficult often to do. And when people are sick, there are more products. So Mexico has become an incredible market for glucose testing kits and testing strips and pharmaceuticals that help to manage diabetes and other chronic diseases. So if we move forward, I'm trying to not take up much more than the time initially allotted so that we have time for Q&A.
You're doing okay.
Okay. I think at this point I'm at about 18 minutes. So I'm going to try to wrap it up in the next few minutes, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as people have. But here's just another example. This is some of the educational materials that are provided to children in school. Anyone who has ever watched 1970s sitcoms from Mexico will recognize these characters have now been turned into cartoons. But there's this idea of, teaching children to be better consumers, to be more healthful consumers, to take a role in their diet, which, kind of undercuts the idea of health and nutrition being coming from communities and coming from families. This is sort of training children to be their own keepers, their own guardians in a very consumer-based world to take care of their own health. If we move on, I just have some images of Walmart. So we started off with Tehuacan and a small community outside of Tehuacan. Tehuacan is a major market, historically a major market center. People come from low and high altitude municipalities all around to sell their agricultural goods historically. And today we can see that even though even just in 2003, which was already, well into the NAFTA period, 90% of food purchases were in tiendas and open-air markets, which are small stores, corner stores, and open-air markets. Today we can see that 35% of food sales are happening in retail environments. There are 14,000 OXXO stores and not as many, but just next in line are the number of 7-Elevens. OXXO is like a 7-Eleven that is owned by FEMSA, which is the Mexican bottler of Coca-Cola. So they sell all Coca-Cola beverages and products, beverages and snack products. And then we can see here, this is inside a Walmart. There are 4 Walmarts in Tehuacan. So at the 4 corners of the city, every road that one takes into or out of the city, one has to pass a Walmart. So a lot of the rural community farmers, as well as small store owners, farmers have a hard time selling their products, and store owners have a hard time competing against this incredible retail market. We'll skip the next slide, and the one after that we will see, this is my friend's mother-in-law who's cooking in her outdoor kitchen. This is an example of food preparation with the milpa-based diet. So this family, their town doesn't grow corn directly, but they participate in local agricultural markets. They produce salt. Their earth, the soil there is too salty for them to grow food in the immediate area, that they have hundreds of years old, if not thousands of years old, trade relationships historically with communities that grow corn. This community produces salt and also produces things out of onyx stone. And this woman here is making memelas in her outdoor kitchen, which are one of the examples of a maize or corn-based food. A lot of the people in these communities have migrated. If we go to the next slide, you can see this is the road into town. On the right, you can see a house that's being built with migrant money, perhaps never to be lived in, because a lot of people have not gone back to their communities, but they're building homes in them nevertheless as a form of savings and with plans perhaps to someday retire there. If we skip the next slide and go to the one after, we will see this is a father and son. Sorry, the one just before.
Sorry.
Other direction. Yeah.
I'm going.
That's okay. This is a father and son wearing Las Vegas and Oregon hats. They have their goats eating the zacate, which are the fallen corn stalks. And it's just another example of the milpa-based approach in which The goats are fed on the fallen corn stalks. Their droppings help to fertilize the soil. The corn is used. The corn husks are used. Everything is somewhat circular. But this gentleman's older son, this is his youngest son, who was wearing a shirt from high school, but it wasn't clear that he was still in high school. But his older brothers have already migrated to Las Vegas and Oregon and have been living there for quite a while. So I'm going to stop there, but I just want to bring back to how Celeste ended in terms of thinking about what would a human-oriented trade deal look like? What would it look like if we, instead of making Mexico undo its subsidies, what if we, in the U.S. and Mexico and Canada too, I'm not sure what my caveat is that my study is not focusing on Canada. I know we have some people on the call who perhaps can fill us in. But what if we, subsidized small-scale farmers? What if we, gave greater value, as was done in the past, to products like corn, which are so central to the ancestral diet, instead of allowing corporations to basically dominate these deals and take all the winnings from them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Carrie, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry about that
okay.
earlier. Thank you, Dr. Galvez. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of great questions for you. So, listeners, if you have a question for Dr. Galvez and you are on the phone, press *6 on your phone, and that will put you into the queue. And while people are piling into the queue, Dr. Galvez, we did have a couple questions in the chat box. One of them was, what about Nabisco? There are huge issues with Nabisco in Canada. Is that a problem in Mexico?
I saw Nestle. Is it Nestle?
Oh, Nestle. Yes, you're right.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm reading down already.
Yeah, I would love to hear from it looks like Trish, about Canada. In Mexico, Nestle has been incredibly culpable in terms of the privatization of water, among other things. I mean, they also produce tons of processed foods and baby formulas and baby milk and all kinds of things that are very problematic. But the water is of concern because they have managed to get concessions from the government to exploit aquifers that are under the ground. This region in Puebla State, among other regions in Mexico, had a massive drought in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, that has never completely ended. And so they deal with chronic drought conditions, and water is a big problem. A lot of the small corn growers have to buy water, and irrigation truck will come in and provide water, an hour of water, 3 hours of water, which is how they calculate the units and the price that they have to pay for watering their fields. And meanwhile, Nestle often is taking water from the earth at no cost, and then, of course, bottling it and selling it. So it's a big issue.
Wow, okay, thank you. Well, let's go to our call queue. We do have several callers in the queue now. Our first question comes from Paul. Paul, your line is open.
Yes, thanks for bringing on the call, Doctor. There's been a lot of momentum in the States, as you're aware, about opposition to genetically modified food. I also know that that's also an issue that's intimate among activists within Mexico.
Yeah.
So how does this come into play? How do we cultivate that energy to stop NAFTA on both sides of the border?
Yeah, there have been some victories and some losses. They have famously achieved a moratorium on Monsanto's efforts to experiment with GMO seeds in Mexico, but some of the earlier experiments, a lot of farmers told me that they, even though the seeds are sterile and are supposed to be confined to the land that has been assigned to the experiments, they find that there's an incredible transfer of, I'm having trouble thinking of the vocabulary in English, but basically the seeds, the GMO materials drift, whether by the wind or pollinators or people sharing seeds, even though they technically maybe aren't supposed to, because they know that they're sterile, but they try anyway. And so there's an incredible transmission of the GMO material well beyond the approved experimental sites, even, when aside from the legal struggle over those. So I think that's a big arena for activism, as you say. I think that's a good angle. I think, there's concern, and there's also, of course, strong movements globally around these issues. And it's very, talking to small farmers in Mexico, it's very poignant because they see this march towards, genetically modified plants, but also what they call, in some cases, fancy goat. One of the goat farmers I spoke to was saying that, he was being pressured to breed a different kind of goat than he had historically. And they talk about these new species as being very fussy. They need more in different kinds of irrigation. They need more in different kinds of chemical inputs. The goats need different kinds of antibiotics. They need different kinds of food. They're not accustomed to getting their hydration just from, eating plants on the mountainside. So a lot of them, made it sound like it was really not very practical to shift over to these things, but there's an incredible pressure to conform to these, ideas of sort of modern agronomy, which, as we know, are being pushed by the corporations as well. So there's a lot of room for activism, certainly in those arenas.
Thanks very much. Okay, our next question comes from caller at area code 360. Your line is open.
Hi. One of the issues with diet-related illness is also connected to the use of municipal sewage sludge and industrial waste on land to grow food, which some of the food uptakes the toxin. Is Mexico importing any of the U.S. sewage sludge for ag, and is this also a practice by Mexico itself?
I do know of some farmers who use gray water to grow their food. I don't know about importing or exporting.
I'm literally just walking to the door.
I will definitely look into that because you've piqued my interest, but I don't know what to say.
It's not gray water. It's actually that's part of it, but it's actually the sludge, the solids, which
I don't know.
Toxic.
I'm going to look into that. Is that something that we've tried to push off? I wouldn't be surprised, push off on our neighbors.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next question comes from caller at area code 530. Your line is open. Caller at area code 530-848.
Sorry, I was muted.
There you are.
Yeah, hi, my name is Lauren Adnelas, and Dr. Galvez, I just wanted to thank you so much for all your work. I already can tell how helpful it's going to be, the work that I do in the communities that I work in. So I have two quick questions. One is, how can we buy your book? And the second one is, on these areas where Nestle and other corporations are working to privatize water in Mexico, is there a way for us to join in their campaigns and make it be more, where we can use our global voices to try and stop these corporations from doing it there as been successful in other places?
Thank you so much for your question. For the book, I'm finishing my revisions now as fast as I can. So the UC Press has about a 7-month production cycle. So if I meet my deadline of turning in the revisions in a couple of weeks, we'll be looking at early spring for the release of the book, and then it should be available wherever books are sold, at least by special order if it's not on the shelf. I would be happy to, alert you all on your Facebook page when it is available, and very happy that it might be useful to the work that you're doing with communities. And then as far as ways to work in solidarity, there's so many organizations from the big multinational, Food First and Slow Food, working on some of these issues. And then in Mexico, there's a lot of maize activism. I can post some links on the Facebook page if that's a good way to get people some direct information.
That would be terrific. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. That'll be great. Yeah, send those to us, post them in our Facebook group, and everybody will see them, and we will send out a follow-up email to everybody that registered for this call. We'll send a follow-up email in a couple days with a video incorporating your slides with the audio, and we'll send any links you give us along with it. So
Wonderful.
Thanks for that. Okay, we have one more caller in the queue. Unless anybody wants to dial in, this is your chance. Just press *6 on your phone, and that will put you into the question queue. Meanwhile, oh no, our question queue is empty. No, it's filling up again. Here we go. Caller at 360, your line is open again.
Hi, thank you. I have another question. What are the churches any help on this? Are they reaching out to protect the farmers and the public?
They are. It's been difficult to, as it is here in the U.S., it's been difficult to get complete clarity in terms of the culpability of the corporations as well as the trade agreement in terms of these ripple effects. So I think some of the ripple effects are better accepted and more widely accepted. So the idea that NAFTA accelerated the displacement of farmers from their land and contributed to migration is very accepted, certainly in migrant pastoralism in the Catholic Church. It's something that I followed a little bit. It's something that was even, I think, present in the 2003 Strangers No Longer statement that was a joint statement by the archbishops of Mexico and the U.S. That, really gave a lot of acknowledgement of the rights of people to move across borders when they are no longer able to make a living. So I think that stuff is a little bit better accepted, but what some of us in the food policy sphere call the tobacco moment hasn't been allowed to happen in the way that it needs to for there to be a clear line of culpability to the corporations for diet-related illness. And so a couple of the slides that I skipped, if you want to go back to them, are comments by a priest who is he's been designated the priest of the migrants in Puebla state, which is the state that sends the most migrants to the New York area. And he, has been working for more than 20 years with migrants, and he attributes diabetes to broken hearts and says that there are metabolical effects, there's a somatization, as he says, of pain, of heartbreak that affects the way the body processes sugar. And he says it in a very, using very metaphorical, spiritual language, but he's quite in keeping with the emergent scientific data on syndemics, which is the idea of co-occurring, the co-occurrence of trauma and violence and structural violence with diabetes in particular, and some other chronic diseases as well. So that is certainly an area where the church has been, the Catholic Church has been quite visible and vocal. But it's been very difficult to point the fingers directly at industry in terms of the way that that the food system has changed. And I don't know if any of you saw in the New York Times over the last several months, starting in December, they've had a series of articles unveiling the use of spyware probably by the Mexican government, because the spyware that was used is, according to its manufacturer, only sold to governments, not to anybody else. But the spyware has been used to spy on nutritionists and dietitians and people working on the soda tax, and they've received death threats. And so there's been a difficulty in kind of getting the word out about the relationship between the rise in consumption of processed foods and beverages and diet-related illness.
Wow, okay, thank you very much. Our next question is from Wendy. Wendy, your line is open.
Thank you. Along the same lines, where is like the toxic-free legislation and fighting the likes of Monsanto and our pesticides and insecticides in our foods down there? And thank you very much for your time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a big part of it, because there also is a lot of emerging evidence that that it's not just a calorie isn't a calorie when some calories are full of chemicals that have been engineered to activate appetites and deactivate the feeling of satiety, and the use of pesticides and herbicides and other chemicals in farming in Mexico has just exploded since NAFTA. The agro-industrial model of factory farming has exploded. People not only are eating a lot more of the processed foods that we saw in the pictures, the sodas and the cereals, but there's been an incredible increase in consumption of pork. The pork industry has been one of the biggest growth industries after NAFTA, and they're fed a potent cocktail of antibiotics, as well as they're fed, like in the factory farming in the U.S., they're fed industrial corn that they're not really very equipped to digest, and so they're fed antibiotics to keep them not only growing faster, but keep them from suffering from nonstop infections from eating inappropriate animal feed. So the animal feed and the chemical industries have been incredible winners with NAFTA, and so that's another angle, I think, for activism, because there are people who've been watching those pieces. For me, I come at this from the angle of a concern with Mexican migration and changing foodways. And so one of the difficulties of the book, but one of the things that I consider to be really incumbent on me, is to try to connect those dots. I don't have the background to explain all of them in great detail, but that's certainly one of the dots that I point to as having an effect. And there's a lot of really well established scientific data that a lot of those chemicals have metabological and endocrinological effects on the body, and so a lot of the diet-related illness has to be related, at least in some part, to that rise in the use of chemicals in food production.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple more questions, in our caller queue. Our next question comes from Skype caller Deborah. Deborah, your line is open. Or a Skype caller.
This would be Rick on Skype.
Hi, Rick. The computer says you're Deborah, but the computer is wrong.
Well, what does Skype know?
That's right.
I'm interested in hearing Dr. Galvez's observations on the conditions in Mexico. And so almost always when we hear NAFTA arguments in the United States, it's in terms of what's best for us, or what's hurting us. And there's so much damage caused by NAFTA in Mexico, losing 2 to 3 million small farmers just in the years that NAFTA came into full force. And there are organizations and there are academics in Mexico that are working against TLC, and I just wonder about the utility of linking up with these academics and linking up with these organizations, because it would seem that until we have a lot more connections, we're just going to be fighting our separate battles,
Absolutely, and I think there are some existing coalitions and conversations in terms of critiques of trade generally, globalization, the agro-industrial farming. But you're absolutely right, and I think a lot of I think for me, one of the things that I am really struck by as I move through the food policy circles is the incredibly different conversations that people are having in different places. When we talk about food policy in the U.S., a lot of times we're talking about really micro-level, consumer-oriented issues. Oftentimes food justice isn't even necessarily a part of those conversations, but sometimes it is. But there's still, this incredible kind of local orientation, which, I think is super important for lots of reasons, but we have to be aware of how our policies spill over. And when we're talking about, like Celeste was talking about before, the fast track authority that trade deals have, that in which trade deals are negotiated, it's really an undemocratic process. And so not only are U.S. voters being left out of these conversations, but really these policies are being foisted on our neighbors in ways that they didn't vote on, and they don't have any opportunity to weigh in on. And so whatever we can do to increase awareness and create spaces for these voices to be heard is better and helpful. And the displacement of farmers, I spoke with one of the people who was at the negotiating table for Mexico when NAFTA was being negotiated, and they initially wanted migration to be a part of the deal. They wanted an orderly system for managing migration to be a part of the deal, and they were told by the U.S. that that migration was off the table. But even so, at the time, Mexico anticipated 50,000 campesinos would be displaced right off the bat with NAFTA, and they considered that to be simply collateral damage. Of course, 1 million people per year in the first 10 years of NAFTA migrated from Mexico to the U.S., not just small farmers. A lot of times people would leave their farms and go to the cities and then eventually migrate internationally. So it's not always a direct relationship between displacement from the land and migration to the U.S. But obviously, people like Trump are very worried apparently about migration, but we have to look at these larger systemic issues and the way that the working class and people in both countries are being really poorly impacted by these.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have 2 more callers in our queue. Do you have time for them, Dr. Gálvez?
Yes.
Good deal. Okay. Then I'm going to close the queue after that, after our next two callers. So caller at area code 815, your line is open.
Yes, I know you talked about it. It gets talked about a lot. How many farmers supposedly lost their farms in Mexico after NAFTA? I'm always looking for a more valid number. I hear such big range. I just wonder if you had anything. And speaking of sludge, I'm originally from Illinois. They use sludge in farms back there, so I'm sure it probably happens in Mexico too. And the funny thing was they'd have to take, I think it was radium out of the water, but the radium ended up in the sludge, and so they dumped the radium back in the field. That's how ridiculous stuff is. So,
oh, gosh.
Anyway, so about how many farmers did you think lost their farms?
Well, I don't have a number right at my fingertips for the farmers. The last caller said 2 to 3 million. It was overall Mexican migration. It was 10% of the Mexican population was in the U.S. by 2006, and it was approximately. Sorry, I just said 1 million a year. It was actually about 500,000 per year for the next decade and a half migrated from Mexico to the U.S. In terms of farmers specifically, I don't have that number right handy, but I can try to find it for you.
Thanks.
Wow. Okay, our last caller is at area code 212. Your line is open.
My neighbor.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Jill McManus. I produced many years ago a video on diabetes prevention for Navajo Nation. And their rates were going up, and it was, of course, the food changes. And that's what the video was portraying. I wonder if you could go, in your wonderful discussion, back to this connection between the spikes in migration to the U.S. and the corn and food and farming situation in Mexico. It seems our politicians just never make the connection.
Well, we could go on about that for another couple of hours, but specifically, which angle did you want me to go back over again?
Well, does your book, or are you preparing to say that some of the spikes in migration since NAFTA of people coming into the U.S. from Mexico is related to food policy and the changes of the corn crops and the corn prices? Didn't we dump a lot of cheaper corn, and so the farmers were put out of business?
Yes, absolutely. So, sorry, when you first said it, I didn't catch that you were asking specifically about corn. Yes, there were many, many ways that NAFTA altered the market for corn specifically. So Mexico was worried, of course, about corn, and even going back before the Mexican Revolution, we see Porfirio Díaz, who was not the nicest president and held on to power for 30-something years, gave special status to corn, even though he thought that Mexico needed to eat more wheat and become very modern, like the wheat-eating countries in Europe. But he acknowledged that corn was so central and crucial and protected it. And the Mexican Revolution, very different political philosophy, also very oriented towards modernity, but a much more inclusive modernity than the preceding regime, also sought to protect corn. So we see this history of corn being treated as a special thing by Mexican governments historically, all the way up until NAFTA is negotiated, and into the NAFTA negotiations, there's concern about not destabilizing the corn market and keeping corn available and affordable, and not, knocking. They wanted to be peasantized. They were open about that. They wanted people to move off of the land and into a more urban and industrial economy, but they didn't think that people would be able to do it right off the bat, and they didn't want to create food shortages in the process. So they built in phased-in protections that would phase out, actually, in NAFTA for the corn growers. The last protections would phase out by 2008, in theory. And the idea was that the U.S. grows such a surplus of corn so cheaply that it would flood into the market if there weren't those protections. So these protections were built into NAFTA. The really sinister thing is that almost immediately, within about 6 months, in these closed-door negotiation rooms, at the trade, where the trade deal was actually hammered out and implemented, the case was made that Mexico had a corn deficit, and that this needed to be addressed with lifting the cap on corn imports from the U.S. to Mexico right away, because otherwise there would be hunger. This was very sinister because Mexico was growing enough corn to feed its population, but the argument was made by the corn growers, in part the corn growers from the Midwest of the U.S., whose corn is not edible per se without processing. It's corn that's used in animal feed and processed foods and beverages as corn syrups, corn starches, and corn fillers. And so these products were given a pass almost immediately. So even though in 2008 was when they were supposed to finally be liberated under the free trade logic, they already were coming in. And so Mexico basically allowed this fiction of the corn deficit to prevail, and it really damaged the corn growers right away. But it also substantively changed what kind of corn was circulating in the Mexican market. It's not nutritionally as healthful. It's, again, used in starches and syrups and fillers and animal feed. And so all of the kind of bad foods get boosted, and the traditional milpa-based diet gets suppressed. And this is all within the logic that Mexico, really tried to sell its own people a comparative advantage, in which Mexico thought that maybe it shouldn't grow corn anymore because the U.S. was so good at it, buying corn, and a food security model as opposed to a food sovereignty model would enable Mexico to, have greater purchasing power with all of its cars and airplanes that it was going to be manufacturing to purchase all the corn it needed. And so there was this idea that, why grow corn if Iowa was so much better at growing it and it could just be purchased on the global market.
Painful. Thank you very, very much. I wish politicians would include this in their thinking.
Trust me, I wish we could get this message out there. So I'm really grateful to all of you for being on this call, because I know all of you are working in these arenas.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Dr. Gálvez, and we hope to have you join us at some other date.
Thank you. I will.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to transition into the next part of our call. Thank you again, Dr. Gálvez, for being with us. And this is Carrie from the corn-producing state of Iowa, apologizing to everybody for corn. We don't like it. It's really hot and humid here, and I blame it on the corn. That and the diabetes. Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Dr. Gálvez.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm going to mute, but I'll still be here. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Well, and if she's going to hang out for a few minutes, if you still have questions for her, maybe try and type them in the chat room, and folks can carry on the conversation over there. Meanwhile, I am going to open the phone line for Hugh Campbell. Hugh is going to do a news report for us. Hugh comes to us as a seasoned financial professional, providing subject matter expertise on a variety of regulatory topics, including the Dodd-Frank Act, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and overall compliance monitoring. He has previously held positions as Chief Risk Officer, Chief Audit Executive, and Director of Sarbanes-Oxley Compliance. He's also the son of a Philadelphia steelworker, and our beloved new Trade Justice Alliance member, Hugh Campbell. Hugh, welcome to the call. Your line is open.
Thank you, Carrie. Good evening, everyone. This past month has had fewer news items than the previous month, but they're more substantive, and many of them revolve around, especially in the last week, about the objectives put out by the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. Without going through the 18 or 19 pages of that document, I'm going to discuss some of the other bullet points on the slides, because the comments by various stakeholders about these trade objectives give you an idea of what the trade objectives are and which organizations favor them and which don't. Friends of the Earth indicated possible stealth attack on public health, food, and agriculture. The Friends of the Earth reiterates this in the text. Hopefully when you get the slides, you'll be able to click the link and see these various PDFs or web pages that support the titles. But Friends of the Earth puts forth various demands that they felt were necessary in NAFTA renegotiations. Among them, NAFTA must not be negotiated in secret. Environmental chapters must be robust and enforceable. And then they mention a number of chapters, including the investment chapter and the investor-state dispute chapter that should be removed, as well as a few other ones. The next point about unions being skeptical of the new NAFTA renegotiation objectives, various union members weighed in about the lack of specificity and the vagueness, but they also weighed in because there were some things that were specific, and the fact that other things weren't specific made them very concerned. Lighthouser emphasized that the new NAFTA presumes benefits to business, but the renegotiation objectives also include several top labor goals, among them rewriting labor rights into the text of the Trade Pact, requiring U.S., Canada, and Mexico to follow some international recognized core labor standards, including freedom of association and collective bargaining, and killing the pro-business trade court. The theme throughout most of these organizations is, number one, even the business-leading Coalition for Prosperous America, that the ISDS chapter should go. The point on the Public Citizens Global Trade Watch is not what was promised. There's another link that I'm going to try to post. I know many of them are blocked. That talks more in depth about public citizens' position and also gives information about various social organizations and civil society stakeholders that make various comments about the NAFTA renegotiation. So I'm going to try to post that into the chat box, but I know sometimes they get blocked.
Excuse me, Hugh, I just wanted to say that I made a slide. It'll be at the end, and it has a lot of these resources. And when you get the slides at the end, a lot of these links are in there, and you can just copy them and paste them into your browser at home.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, that's all right. the Sierra Club plans released by the administration today were generally silent on objectives put forth by environmental groups and other outlined by union, family farmers, and consumer groups. Instead, the concrete objectives today announced pertain to vague platitudes. Now, the outlier in these bullet points is the Coalition of Prosperous America, and in this title supports Trump's administration's newly released NAFTA objectives as an important change in direction of U.S. trade strategy. Never before has a president prioritized the reduction of the U.S. trade deficit in trade negotiations. So that's their major point. They also were very happy to see the elimination of Chapter 19 on the dispute settlement. But like many other organizations, Coalition of Prosperous America, if NAFTA cannot be renegotiated properly, they feel that we should withdraw from it. I have two more slides with various bullet points on news, most of which are self-explanatory, but I'd like to add some information about the one on Ford. Now, Ford is going to start producing all their Ford Focuses in China, and no longer in Michigan and Mexico. And this is very significant, and it will probably affect Ohio, Indiana, and southern Michigan the most. There's also a bullet point on the China's sovereign wealth. They're always pushing to be able to invest more in U.S. companies, and not mentioned in the article, but most concerning is in the rare earth area, where there's a bankrupt rare earth mine in the United States that the Chinese are trying to take over, and if they do, there'll be a monopoly on by China on rare earth, which will create a big problem for the semiconductor industry. I'm going to try to put in that text box that link to the other public citizens page. Hopefully I'll be successful. That's pretty much my report on trade.
Great.
News.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Okay, our next speaker tonight is our own beloved Adam Weissman. Adam is going to talk to us about action items, things that you can do to make all of this information real. Adam is an organizer with Global Justice for the Animals and the Environment and a member of Trade Justice New York Metro, as well as our web guy and our email guy and a whole lot of our outreach guy, our speaker guy. Adam does a lot for us. Adam, welcome to the call.
Thank you, Carrie. And before I get to the bulk of what I'm going to be discussing, which is some of the ways that we can learn more and take action, I wanted to make a brief point about how the agenda of liberalizing trade to expand agriculture exports for U.S. corporate agribusiness is something that we're dealing with in legacy form with NAFTA, the ongoing destructive effects and the harm that's already been wrought by NAFTA's liberalization of agriculture. But it's important for us to understand that this process is continuing. In the last, just this month, 2 weeks ago, we saw the U.S. finalize a deal with China to allow U.S. beef exports into China for the first time since 2003. Then this week, the U.S. struck a deal that for the first time is going to allow rice to be exported to China. So we're just spent a good portion of a call talking about corn exports to Mexico. exporting corporate exports of a traditional staple crop, and now we're doing the same thing again with China. So pretty sobering, and really just speaks to why this fight for global trade and food justice needs to continue. So on that note, how can we continue that fight? Well, the first thing we can do is learn more. Our friends at Citizens Trade Campaign and Public Citizen are going to be hosting a NAFTA renegotiation briefing call on July 27th, in just a few days, 4 days from now. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern, and their special guest will be Larry Cohn, who's the board chair of Our Revolution and former president of Communication Workers of America. He is a long-time and strong voice in the fight for fair trade, and will be a great opportunity to go into greater depth about some of the points that we heard about tonight from Celeste and Hugh. If you'd like to read some of the various statements that have been put out by civil society groups, that some of which Harriet will be presenting on the slide later in the call, and that Hugh told us a bit about, Citizens Trade Campaign has compiled some of those statements on their website. We've made a short link to it that you can find at tradejustice.net/statement. By the way, for people who want to register for the NAFTA renegotiation briefing call webinar that I just mentioned, you can do that by going to tradejustice.net/72717. Again, that's tradejustice.net/72717. For those of you who this is going too fast for, or if you're in audio-only mode and you can't see this on your screen, all this information will be available after the fact in the video from the webinar, and we also make the slide presentation available. And we can also send out these links as well. So if this is all going too fast, there'll be many other ways to get this information. Also, one other ongoing source of trade news that comes out pretty much every day, we have an email list called Trade Justice News. It is an email list where we post news articles and other information. This is not our newsletter, which really only comes out about once a month, but this is a daily list where you can get trade news stories as they're happening if you really want to keep abreast of the issue. So to sign up for that email list, you can go to tradejustice.net/TJ-list. Oh, that's all lowercase, tradejustice.net/TJ-list. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the actions that we can take? As we're all aware, the August congressional recess may be postponed, but it is going to happen eventually. So this is a critical time for us to reach out to our members of Congress while they're home in district and let them know that it is absolutely vital that they take a strong stand that any renegotiated NAFTA must be a fairer deal or is not worth supporting. We don't need a NAFTA that is merely a smaller version of TPP. We don't need a NAFTA that locks in all the problems with the existing NAFTA model. We need an agreement that to be supported at all needs to be based on a fundamentally new model. So one baseline, our friends at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, in order to have a simple, focused demand, are saying that an absolute bright line has to be that any new trade agreement, at minimum to be even considered for support, must not contain investor-state dispute settlements. That does not mean that any NAFTA that doesn't contain ISDS is necessarily worth supporting, but it does mean that if ISDS is in any new agreement, then it is dead on, as far as we're concerned, it's dead on arrival. And we need to let our elected officials know that any trade agreement, whether it's a new NAFTA or any other deal, that contains ISDS must be an agreement that they support, that has to be the starting point for any new negotiation, and then beyond that we can talk about what else we'd want to see in a new agreement. Like, for example, an agreement that tried to fix a NAFTA that tried to fix some of the damage that was done through agricultural liberalization, a NAFTA that did not contain energy proportionality rules that drive destructive projects like the Athabasca tar sand extraction project, a NAFTA that locks in, that builds labor rights and environmental standards into core text and not into toothless side agreements. Those are all important considerations for a new agreement. But before we even get to any of those things, we need to know that ISDS is not part of the deal. And so that's a critical message that we can take to our elected officials, and there are many ways that we can do that. First of all, find out who represents you if you don't already know. Go to tradejustice.net/LEG, all lowercase, and we have a tool there that you can use to find your elected officials. You can write to your representatives. There are those online forms that you can fill out, but a personally written letter is much more effective, and we can provide you with sample letters. You can shoot me an email, and I can send you a sample. I'm adam@tradejustice.net. You can write letters to the editor and op-eds talking about why it's so important for your representative to say that we don't want to see a trade agreement that will make our tax base or make our national treasury vulnerable yet again. We saw just last year an ISDS case where the U.S. was sued for $15 billion because of President Obama's decision to block the extension of the Keystone XL pipeline. We don't want to see this kind of corporate extortion continue, where our responsible public policy decisions based on concern for the environment or other public interests will be compromised by the threat of multi-billion-dollar corporate suits. We don't want to see more suits like the metal-clad suit against Mexico, where Mexico had a toxic waste site shoved down their throats, or the many cases where Canada has been coerced into accepting toxic pesticides and fuel additives because of ISDS cases. We don't want to see more cases like the Lone Pine Resources case where Canada is being sued for Quebec's moratorium on fracking. These are the kind of points that we need to make in letters to the editor and op-ed, saying that we want our representatives to come down strong against any NAFTA that contains ISDS. Our representatives, while they're in district, will be presumably, well, some of them may be in hiding, but some of them will be making their presence known in district through town halls. Those that haven't canceled their town halls for fear of voters asking why they want to kill their health care. Some of them will be showing up at Congress on Your Corner events, where they pick a street corner or a popular thoroughfare and answer questions from voters. These are great opportunities to publicly ask our elected officials questions about where they stand on a fair deal as a replacement for NAFTA, and whether they'd be willing to say that if we can't get a NAFTA that is ISDS free, NAFTA should be scrapped. They may be in district doing fundraisers. Great opportunity to show up and ask them questions. And if they're already giving us unsatisfactory answers, ask their donors questions. I can be out there with flyers. We can show up in their district offices and with drop-in visits, where you don't necessarily schedule an appointment, but you just show up and speak to the staff, express your concerns, maybe have a flyer or a letter to deliver, and let them know that as a constituent, you're concerned about fairer trade policies, and think that while we welcome NAFTA renegotiation, it has to be towards a better deal, not just a deal that will modernize NAFTA to the satisfaction of corporations. And finally, we can go back to the last slide for just a moment more. You can schedule a visit to meet with your representative while they're in district. This is something that's important to do as soon as possible, so you can get an appointment in their busy schedules while they're in their district. Reach out to groups in your community, reach out to environmental groups, labor unions, religious leaders, Mexican solidarity activists, Mexican immigrants, and others, workers who've been affected by NAFTA, and invite them to join you for a visit with your elected official to say why fixing NAFTA, or better yet replacing or scrapping NAFTA, matters to them, and why they're counting on your representative to take a stance that any future NAFTA must be ISDS free, and also a great opportunity to talk about some of the other concerns we have about NAFTA. So there are tools that we can also use to reach out to members of our community, and also to show our elected officials that people care about this issue. I mentioned before the online alerts. Well, those online alerts are not as effective as a personal handwritten letter, but if we want a low-bar engagement tool to get people involved and to just spread the information about the issue, that can be a great way to reach out and get people looped in. There are tools put out by a variety of different groups towards that, and Public Citizen has a more generic form letter that people can fill out. The AFL-CIO has a form letter that is labor-focused, of course, and the Sierra Club has an environment-focused letter all about having NAFTA pushing our the U.S. Trade Representative and the Trump administration towards a commitment to renegotiating a fairer deal. They're all Public Citizen also has postcards available. You can email contact@replacenafta.org to request copies of these cards that you can get signed in your community. Next slide, please. And for folks in New York City, just tomorrow, there's going to be an event that Representative Nydia Velázquez is holding with speakers including Lori Wallach from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, the political director of Our Revolution. Malu Wajuca del Toro, who's been a speaker on Our Calls before, is going to be a speaker. It's a large panel with representatives from labor, small business, and others. And this is a field hearing about NAFTA. And so people are invited to attend if you're in the New York area, hear the speakers, possibly ask questions. And if you are not in the New York area, you can also watch online. This will be live streamed at the Replace NAFTA Facebook page. If you'd like to receive an email when the stream goes live, you can sign up at replacenafta.org and further alerts. For folks who want to register for the live event, you can the in-person event, you can go to replacenafta.org/NYC. Next slide, please. Finally, our friends at Popular Resistance, the folks who run Trade for People and Planet, have a new letter writing tool to make letters to the editor on NAFTA easy. You can, there's a very long URL. Let's see if we can post it in the chat box. For those of you, I will read it aloud for those of you who are in phone-only mode. But it's a long URL. It's flushthetpp.org/letter-to-the editor. Dashes between every word. Letter to the editor campaign, NAFTA is not for us. Those are dashes, not underscores. Again, that's flushthetpp.org/letter-to-the-editor campaign, NAFTA is not for us, with dashes between each word. And so this is a tool that will help you construct a letter to your local newspapers to help spread the word on this issue and increase the pressure on our elected officials to support a fair deal.
Well, thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us as long as you have. Please be sure to join us next month for our Sunday webinar. Our next webinar will be on August 20th. And we're going to have Celeste Drake from AFL-CIO, for those of you that were on the call earlier tonight. The same Celeste, it's her again. We love Celeste. Celeste is going to talk, and Michael Stumo for Coalition for Prosperous America are going to discuss the Trump team's NAFTA objectives. So we'll have a lot more information on that. We'll probably have some other speakers lined up by then too. And you can register for that and all of our upcoming webinars at tradejustice.net/callreg. That'll get you hooked up. Okay, and there's me again. I'm Carrie. And I want to remind you that we do make YouTube videos out of all of these webinars. Once the call is completed, I will put together all of the slides that you've been watching with the audio and make a YouTube video. All of those videos are on a YouTube playlist that you can access at our website, tradejustice.net/webinar-vids. And so if you've missed any in the past or want to compare and contrast how we did the TPP thing and we're so successful at turning that around, there's a lot of good reasons to seek out the old videos too. And of course, whenever you watch them, please comment, like, share, subscribe to the channel. All of that helps the whole campaign because it makes it more visible on Google and on YouTube for when other people are searching about information about NAFTA. Next slide, please. And if you would like to support us at Trade Justice Alliance, we really need help. We need all kinds of help. If you are a person that can help plan, organize, and promote our webinars, we want to talk to you. Our planning calls are every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. It's the same phone number that you're listening on now. It's on the screen. It's 712-770-4160. And then put in your PIN, 802-787-POUND. Every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern. We get together and we talk about what speakers we're going to have next, how the call will flow, how we can do outreach to increase our audience and spread the word and education even further. So please join us if you can. And if you are able to throw us $1 or $3, we do have a donation page set up now. A few of our tools do cost a little bit, and we are ever so grateful for every little bit. Every little bit counts. And so if you're able to donate a couple bucks to us, you can get a link at tradejustice.net/TJA donate. Okay.
Beautiful. Okay, I'll just mention this, Carrie. Thank you so much. And yay to Carrie for doing all the great work on all those tech tools and the videos that she does. She does that. So we're really happy that she does that for us. So what I did, I compiled a number of links on this resources slide, and these are sector-specific reactions to the NAFTA negotiating objectives. There are numerous reactions available. These are just some of them, and they're from various sectors: labor, the environment, public citizen, IATP, and also if you go to citizenstrade.org/CTC, and the link is right here also, you'll find more. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Give me just a second, and I'm going to open up all the lines.
Thanks, everybody. Stay on
Thank
with us
you.
if you like at the end.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Anybody that's left? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great call.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks for sticking with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Great to hear your voice, Harriet.
Thank you.
You too, Wendy.
Thanks, Kit.
Have fun, everybody, making all kinds of top hats and neat things for the protests and rallies coming up.
That's right. Thanks.
Sharpen your pitchforks and torches.
Yeah.
All righty, miss y'all.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Miss you too.
Keep up the fight.
See you next month.
Thank you.
Bye, Wendy.
Take care.
Talk to you soon. Bye, Gottheimer.